So let's finish up Chapter 10, the Union in Peril, Section 4, Slavery and Secession. So we have been seeing this rather crazy, divisive, getting really ugly decade of the 1850s, and we've seen that slavery question grow and become something that was, no longer something you could ignore and no longer something you could pretend wasn't there, and that more and more people have a strong opinion about. And seeing this become an issue that maybe divided North and South a little bit to now something that divides them completely, and something that is no longer going to be able to be compromised over, and that is eventually going to erupt into division and secession and civil war. So where we last left off, we saw the slavery question cause the dissolution of the Whig Party, and we saw the Free Soil movement come up and the formation of the Republican Party. So now moving into 1858, we see a court case. The Supreme Court eventually even chooses to weigh in on this slavery question in a case that was truly meant to put an end to the whole slavery question, meant to make the whole thing kind of go away, but actually just causes further division and further confusion about the whole slavery debate. And so this case is called the Dred Scott case, or officially Dred Scott versus Sanford, or sometimes we call it the Dred Scott decision. And so this was in 1857, and again, this was where the question about slavery and its legality and different constitutional issues around it actually end up in the Supreme Court. So let's take a look at the background of this case. Dred Scott was a slave who sued for his freedom because he'd been taken by his owner to a free territory. He was originally from the state of Missouri, but he was taken by his owner, who was, I believe, an army doctor, to what would today be Minnesota, but at the time was a territory. And that's territory that was made free by that Missouri Compromise. You have to remember that Missouri Compromise to understand the Dred Scott decision. If you recall, Missouri Compromise, which was back in 1820, that was the one that set up that 36 degrees 30 line and said no slavery above that line. So Dred Scott is reasoning because he had lived above 36 degrees 30, he'd lived in a place that was free, and so he argued that he was a free man. He said that once he crossed into free territory or into a place where slavery was not legal and not protected by law, that he was a free man. A lower court ruled him free, and then a court higher than that said he was still a slave, and then this ends up in the Supreme Court. And so they're actually looking at several things here. They're looking at the question of Dred Scott's freedom, but they are also looking at the issue of that 36 degrees 30 line in Missouri and the constitutionality of slavery there and those kinds of things. So let's take a look at what the Supreme Court rules in this case, what is decided in the Dred Scott decision, which is arguably one of the most infamous, which means famous for a bad reason, one of the most infamous decisions the United States Supreme Court has ever made, what some people would argue is one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made. And the Supreme Court was led at the time by the Chief Justice called Roger Taney. So although Roger Taney is not the only one who makes this decision, his name kind of gets attached to it. He's kind of associated with it because he was leading the court at the time, and he is the one who actually wrote out this decision. So let's take a look at the ruling in the Dred Scott case. There are three major parts to this ruling. The first part of the ruling is the Supreme Court said that Dred Scott was still a slave. They ruled him still a slave, that his time on free soil did not make him a free man, and that he was still bound to the laws of the state of Missouri, and so just crossing into a free territory did not make him free. So that part's bad enough. But then they get even further into this, and then it gets even worse, and it gets even really uglier and some quite shocking things. The second part of the ruling is that Taney says that Dred Scott never even had the right to sue to begin with, that he never should have even been able to take this to court from the beginning because he was not a citizen. Because he was an African American, he was not a citizen, and therefore did not have the rights of an American citizen, including the right to sue. And he reasons this not because Dred Scott was a slave, but because he was really African American, saying that African Americans could not be citizens, that they did not have the same rights as white people, free or slave. He makes a very infamous statement where he says that African Americans did not have any rights that quote, a white man was bound to respect. And there he really is contradicting himself, because technically, as a lot of legal scholars will point out today, if he's saying the case is doesn't have legal standing, that Dred Scott couldn't sue to begin with, then he really ought to have tossed the case out, but he continues to rule on it anyway. The third and the final final part of the Dred Scott ruling, and the part that is probably the most important, that often gets forgotten, I notice, by students, is they rule the Missouri Compromise to be unconstitutional. They are tossing out that Missouri Compromise line, that whole 36 degrees 30 thing, invalidating that, striking it down, and saying Congress never had the authority to issue that to begin with, that violates the Constitution. And their legal reasoning as to why that violates the Constitution, they specifically argue that it violates the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, part of the Bill of Rights, protects a person's right to property. And so the Supreme Court under Roger Taney is ruling right here that slaves are property, and therefore to tell a person that you can't take slaves into a certain territory, or you can't take slaves above this line or to this place, that would violate their constitutional right to property. So this is a devastating blow for abolitionists, for free soilers, and again, it was meant by Roger Taney and the Supreme Court to say slavery has to be allowed to be taken in the territories. Congress does not have any authority to restrict slavery in the territories at all. Now, they're not saying here that slavery has to be allowed everywhere. They are saying they would agree that states have the right to ban it, but Congress can't. And so to ban it in the territories would be unconstitutional. Again, they base that on the Fifth Amendment. Now, as I was saying, Roger Taney and the Supreme Court meant for this to kind of put a rest to the slavery question, but it does not do that. It, of course, keeps going on. But obviously, this is also another thing for people to be quite divided about, because some people are very excited about the Dred Scott decision and think it's the best thing ever, and then others are shocked and horrified and appalled by it and refuse to accept it. Obviously, Southerners are extremely pleased. Slaveholders are extremely pleased by this, because this is basically saying they are allowed to take their slaves wherever they want, that slaves are property, that they are protected by the Constitution, and so you can't ban it at all. And so Southerners are very, very pleased with that, and they feel vindicated. They feel like this is the end of the argument. That's it. They won. And the Dred Scott decision needs to be enforced. Of course, Northerners, free soilers, abolitionists, they are appalled by this. This puts the whole idea of free soil into question, because the free soilers say don't allow slavery to expand. Well, the Dred Scott decision just said you can't stop it from expanding. But they will survive this. This was meant to kind of be the tell them to drop dead kind of a thing, but it doesn't. They will survive it. They will just argue that it's wrong, and the Supreme Court was not correct in this case, and they're going to keep on pushing for what they push for. So it becomes a further divisive thing, and really just only makes this slavery question worse, and causing some people also to become quite confused, and also confusing because a lot of people have, politicians and leaders have kind of built their careers on certain positions regarding slavery, that now the Supreme Court seems to have thrown into question, or seems to have invalidated, seems to have said that can't work. Now, one of those politicians that has really been kind of thrown for a loop here is Stephen Douglas, because Stephen Douglas is one of those politicians that has based his career on the whole popular sovereignty thing. He has said, let people choose whether or not they can allow slavery or not allow slavery. Well, again, the Dred Scott decision basically said people can't ban it, so what does popular sovereignty even work? Now, all this confusion, as destructive as it can be, as ugly as it can be, and as difficult as it can be for some people, it also provides an opportunity for a lot of folks, one particular person that we're going to look at, to make a better name for themselves and to rise to national prominence, and that's going to be Abraham Lincoln. He really turns out to be kind of the big winner in all of this. We are merely 2 years away from the outbreak of the Civil War. Some of you may be wondering, well, where's Lincoln in all this? We know he's going to be the president during the Civil War, so why isn't he a part of all of this? And that's because at this point in time, Lincoln is still relatively unknown. He has not had too much of a career in national politics, but that's about to change. And Lincoln's going to rise to national prominence, or become a little bit better known, in 1858 as a result of his running for senator of Illinois. He's not running for president yet. But just a little bit of a background on Lincoln. He is from Illinois. He's a lawyer. And he was a Whig, but is now a free soiler, or became a free soiler, and then becomes a Republican. So his stance on slavery is free soil. We tend, at least at this point, we tend to think of Lincoln as this great abolitionist, and of course we know why, but at this point in time he really isn't. Lincoln does not like slavery for sure. He disagrees with it. He thinks that it is immoral, but he also thinks that it is legal. So he's not advocating getting rid of slavery where it already exists, but he does not think that it should be allowed to expand westward. So he wants to contain it. So he's a free soiler, And in 1858, he is going to challenge Stephen Douglas for Senator of Illinois. So he's going to try to run against him. And that is where we get something called the Lincoln-Douglas debate. It's a debate, you know, it's like a public argument. And it's where Lincoln and Douglas are going to go around to different towns all over Illinois, publicly, you know, crowds come to watch them, and they're going to publicly debate different issues, and people can, you know, get a feel for which candidate they like best. And there's a lot of important things that come out of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The most important one that we're going to talk about is something called the Freeport Doctrine. And it's named the Freeport Doctrine because that's the town in Illinois where they were. And this was Douglas's answer to a question about how people in a territory could exclude slavery. So Lincoln, you know, knows that Douglas is kind of in a weird position because he's bet everything on popular sovereignty, and now that's confusing as to whether or not that's even okay. And so he says to him, hey, is there any way that people in a territory, if they don't want slavery, is there any way they could keep it out? Is there any way they could prevent it? Douglas's answer to that question is called the Freeport Doctrine. And what Douglas says there, instead of saying popular sovereignty and all of that, he says if people in a territory don't want slavery, they just shouldn't pass a slave code. They don't pass a slave code and you won't have it. So that's the Freeport Doctrine. If you don't want slavery in a territory, don't pass a slave code. You may recall that slave codes were the laws that governed slavery, that set up slavery, that protected it, that defined slaves as property, that took all the rights away from slaves and those kinds of things. And Douglas's reasoning here is, you know, if you don't pass a slave code, if there are no laws to govern slavery, then you didn't ban it. You didn't tell people they couldn't have slaves, but you also created a situation in which slavery is just not going to work. And no slave owner in their right mind is going to take slaves and go settle in a place where there's no slave code. So that was his answer. That's the Freeport Doctrine. So we may be going, well, what in the world does that have to do with anything big deal? Here's the thing with the Freeport Doctrine. The Freeport Doctrine is really going to make the South mad. The South, you know, loved the idea of the Dred Scott decision, and for Douglas to say, hey, there's a way around it, there's still a way to ban slavery, after that, the South is not going to want to have anything to do with Stephen Douglas. They will stop supporting him. He might have been someone that the South could have gotten behind up until then, but not anymore after the Freeport Doctrine. And that may not be a very big deal for Douglas as long as he's a senator from Illinois, but if he runs for president, which he will run for president just 2 years after this, he's going to need the South's support, and he's not going to get it anymore after that whole Freeport Doctrine. So as far as the Lincoln-Douglas debates overall, in the end, the winner and the loser. In the short run, Douglas wins. Douglas wins his Senate seat back. He wins that election. He defeats Lincoln. But in the long run, he loses because he has now lost the South. He's lost their support. And that's going to cost him in the election of 1860, which we're going to look at in just a few minutes. As far as Lincoln is concerned, you have a short-term gain, short-term loss rather, and a long-term loss. Lincoln, said that backwards, sorry. Lincoln loses this election. He does not get elected senator, but he gains notoriety. People are starting to listen to him. People are starting to know who he is. I wouldn't call him a big celebrity at this point, but he's certainly more known than he was, and he's putting himself in a pretty good position to be the Republicans' nominee for president just 2 years after this. And people are kind of seeing him as someone who is very articulate, someone who's not incredibly divisive, and someone who just seems to have kind of a good head on his shoulders when it comes to a lot of things. He's not really extreme. So he's going to really win out in the end and be in a very, very good place, even though he does not win this Senate seat. Now things become further tense and further potentially violent, and really the time for compromise seems to have passed after 1859, when there's a near violent incident. It doesn't actually erupt in violence, but it almost does. When an abolitionist called John Brown tries to lead a slave revolt. Now, John Brown was an extreme abolitionist, radical, violent, but unlike your Garrisons and your Frederick Douglasses and those kind of people who would make speeches and publish papers and give talks and that kind of thing, John Brown is someone who is incredibly religious, who believes that God has called him to end slavery and that he should use violence if he has to. He believes that violence is what it's going to take. He thinks that, you know, the South is not going to end slavery unless there is bloodshed, and he has to do that. He considers himself called to that. So he's not a write letters and make speeches kind of a guy. He is a grab your gun, grab your knives, and go and kill people if you have to kind of a guy. He had already been involved in some of the violence in Bleeding Kansas, and then in 1859 1859 believes that it is time for him to lead a slave revolt to overthrow slavery in the South. And so he plans to raid an arsenal, which is a stockpile of weapons, in a town called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His sons are with him, and he assumes that slaves in the area, when they hear about this uprising, that they will come and join him. He will distribute all the weapons to the slaves, make an army, and then their army will just grow, and they will go on this massive crusade, rebelling through the South and killing all the slave owners and leading this slave revolt and overthrowing slavery. Well, obviously it doesn't end that way. John Brown actually never even gets out of that arsenal. He storms the arsenal. No slaves come to join him. Marines are dispatched. He is captured. Some of his sons are killed in the process. He is put on trial for treason, is found guilty of treason, and is executed. So you may be wondering, well, if the guy ends up getting caught and executed and he doesn't lead a slave revolt, in reality, why is it such a big deal, and what causes such a big problem? Well, it has to do with, again, the interpretation, how the North sees it one way and the South sees it another way, and what this seems to prove to both sides, what it seems to convince them completely of, and how it divides them further and pushes them further away from each other, and makes it less possible, or really impossible by this point, that they're going to be able to reconcile and work this out. Because Northerners, people in the free states, abolitionists and others, saw John Brown as a hero. They saw him as a martyr. He was an angel. He was Christ-like. He was someone who gave his life and sacrificed himself to try to free slaves, and who was unjustly killed for his cause. And they were just, they were mourning, and they were ringing church bells on the day of his execution. And you have images like this one here that portray him as this kind, gentle, kind of grandfatherly sort of man that needed to be looked up to, and he was someone to be admired and praised for what he did. Of course, Southerners saw him as dangerous. They were terrified by this. They saw someone like John Brown as terrifying, as violent, as a threat. To them, this was proof that Northerners want to kill them all, that Northerners want violence, that Northerners want bloodshed, that they want to see all the slave owners dead, that they want to fight. And it convinces many Southerners that they have to start getting ready to defend themselves, that there's a fight coming, and if they don't defend themselves, then they're going to lose everything. And furthermore, when they see Northerners praising this guy and calling him an angel and all this sort of thing, they're just further convinced that the North's out to get them. And this is a point where a lot of Southerners really do start to militarize, start to think about, gathering their weapons, preparing to fight. Some historians call this kind of the beginning of the Confederate Army, even though we're still a year away from all of that. This is where really the South has very much closed itself and has closed off the possibility of future compromise, and has kind of agreed amongst themselves that they're not going to compromise on this anymore, and that they can't work with the North anymore. So at this point, all hope of compromise, or the willingness to compromise on both sides, is pretty much gone, and it kind of is sort of a matter of time before the South finally makes good on the threats they have made multiple times by now, and that is to secede, to withdraw, to leave the Union and say we are no longer part of the United States. But the event that actually catalyzes that whole thing, that causes that to happen, that begins that process, is a presidential election, the election of 1860. The South is going to be displeased enough and angry and upset enough about the results of this election that they are going to say, no thanks, we're done, and start seceding. So let's take a look at this election. Kind of some unusual things happen. The Republicans in 1860 are going to nominate Abraham Lincoln, whom we saw not too long ago. Obviously, slavery is the big issue in this election, and each candidate and each party, that is like issue number one, that everybody wants to know what your stance is. And the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln's stance is free soil. They are careful to say that they don't want to abolish slavery everywhere. They are not going to abolish slavery everywhere. They just want to make sure that it does not spread any further. Obviously, Southerners don't care either way. They're not going to support that. Now, the Democrats get a little interesting, because the Democrats can't agree on a candidate. When they hold their convention to nominate their man for president, they have a big argument, and the whole thing disrupts and splits, because the person who has the majority of votes is Stephen Douglas. But recall, after that whole Freeport Doctrine thing, the Southern delegates won't have it. They say, we will not support Stephen Douglas. He's hostile to the South. He says there's ways and that you should be trying to restrict slavery in the territories. We're not going to have that. So the Southern Democrats wouldn't say yes to that. So the Democrat Party actually splits. And so there are actually two Democratic parties in the election of 1860, the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats are going to go ahead and nominate Stephen Douglas, and they're going to continue to run on that idea of popular sovereignty. The Southern Democrats are going to reconvene a few days later and nominate their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge, and they run on the platform of enforcing the Dred Scott decision and allowing slavery to expand west. And then, to further complicate things, not only do we have this split in the Democratic Party, which means that the vote is going to get split, and they pretty much shot themselves in the foot. There's no way they're going to be able to get a majority with the votes being split between Douglas and Breckinridge. But then, to further complicate it, we also have the addition of a fourth party in this election. This is a one of these one and done kind of parties. This is not a permanent thing. It springs up in this election, and that's the only time that we see them. And it's a group called the Constitutional Union Party. They're going to nominate a guy named John Bell, and they, even as their name suggests, union. This is a sort of a compromise party that wants to continue compromising, that wants to leave things as they are, that is worried that the slavery question has become too divided, so they're kind of like, let's just compromise and keep compromising and work this thing out and not take large stances on it either way. Well, obviously we know who is going to win this election, and that's going to be Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln is going to win the election, even though he gets less than 40% of the popular vote, because he gets the majority in the Electoral College, but with all the other votes being split between Douglas and Breckinridge and Bell, he gets with less than 40%. So he is one of the small handful of presidents that wins without getting the majority of the popular vote. And he does not take any southern states. In fact, most southern states didn't even include Lincoln on the ballot because they were so offended by his very existence. But Lincoln wins anyway. And that is what triggers the South to say, that's it, we're done, we've had enough. So it is Lincoln's election that leads to what we call the first wave of secession. Remember that secession, to secede, means to leave the Union, to withdraw, to say we are finished. And that is going to happen after Lincoln is elected, starting with the state of South Carolina. We've seen South Carolina be first in line to do some extreme things before. So they are the first ones to vote for secession on December 20th, 1860. They waste no time in doing that, as Lincoln was just elected the month before in November. And then other states are going to follow suit. They say if this is a country where somebody like Lincoln can be elected, if someone can be elected without taking any of our support, we don't want to be a part of it anymore. And so South Carolina leads the way, but then over the next several weeks, several other southern states are also going to do the exact same thing, call conventions and vote to secede themselves. And by February of 1861, 11 southern states, no, not 11, eventually it'll be 11, but I think 7 of them have seceded, including, of course, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Texas, and Louisiana, I believe, are in that first group. So by February of 1861, that handful of southern states that have seceded, leaders from them met in Montgomery, not too far from us, to form their new country, their new nation, as they would call it. And Montgomery does serve as the first capital of the Confederacy. This picture here on this slide, this is the Alabama state capitol, taken on the day that the Confederate president was inaugurated. But they meet there to form their new government, their new country, which they call the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, and it is a confederation. Now remember, that's a specific type of government. Think about the Articles of Confederation, that it's a weak central government. It is not a very powerful one. They want stronger state governments. They would argue that that was the reason for secession, was because they felt like the principle of states' rights had been violated. So this is a weak central government, most powers with the states. It does have a president. They select Jefferson Davis to be their president. He's from Mississippi. But this is a very weak government, and keep that in mind, because that's something that will become quite a problem for them as the war goes on, which the war hasn't started just yet. So they form their country, write their constitution, all of those things, and now everybody is just kind of waiting and watching to see what will happen when Lincoln takes office, because Lincoln's been elected at this point, but he's not the president yet. And there's questions about, okay, is he just going to allow this? Are we just going to let the Confederacy go? Or is there going to be a fight here? And some people want that, some people don't, but everybody just kind of waiting with bated breath to see what happens next. And of course, that's what we'll look at in Chapter 11, as we know this is going to result in an ugly and long civil war.